On September 14th, 1901, first-class stoker Henry Bridge wrote a letter to his father that would later be considered prophetic. Quote, "Am leaving on Monday morning to Newcastle to bring torpedo-boat destroyer round to Portsmouth. We are chancing our lives in the new boat, and should not be surprised if she went up, smash."
Hello, and welcome to the Shipwreck Archive.
Thank you. Would you happen to have the story, The Tragic Weight of the Cobra?
Here we are. Enjoy!
In 1900, 2 torpedo-boat destroyers were introduced to the British Royal Navy as the fastest ships afloat. Both ships used Parsons steam turbines, the first ships in the British Navy to use steam turbine engines. The first ship to be purchased by the Navy, the Viper, was also the fastest, designed personally by Parsons, the inventor of the engine, though it had been built by the shipyard Hawthorne, Leslie and Company. The Viper proved able to reach 43 miles an hour, boasting a top speed of 5 or 6 knots over what any other ship at the time could manage. It caused a wave of excitement for turbine vessels, and soon the Navy was presented with the Viper's sister ship, the Cobra. The Cobra had been built by the shipyard of Armstrong, Whitworth and Company, and was also provided with a Parsons steam turbine. The Cobra had actually been built before the Viper as an experiment by the Armstrong, Whitworth and Company shipyard, but when the Viper had proved to be a success, the Navy took an interest in her. After witnessing the sea trials of the Cobra, the Admiralty immediately purchased her and began to get her ready for service. She was going to be the second fastest vessel in their fleet after the Viper. The 2 sister ships would never get a chance to serve together. On August 3, 1901, almost exactly a year after the triumphant announcement of her record-breaking speed, the Viper was engaged in naval maneuvers when disaster struck. The ships were making practice runs on each other when a thick fog descended on them. The Viper immediately slowed from 20 knots to 5 knots. But the fog was thick enough that even at this reduced speed, she struck a rock with enough force that she broke her back and sank near the caskets. Fortunately, the crew kept their heads and the ship was calmly evacuated, with no lives lost. Though the Navy would later attempt salvage, the Viper would later be determined to be a total loss, too damaged to raise and breaking up quickly. The Cobra was still at Armstrong, Whitworth and Company when the Viper sank, but the Navy was soon informed that the ship was ready for delivery. As she departed from the shipyard on the Tyne on the morning of the 17th of September, 1901, she had on board 54 officers and men as a navigation party from the Navy, as well as 25 men from the shipyard who were put on the ship to see her safely delivered and show her workings. She was traveling under the command of Lieutenant Alan Bosworth Smith of the HMS Wellington. At least one member of the crew provided by the shipyard had been part of the crew who had delivered the Viper to the Navy when she had been completed. James Crichton was a marine engineer who had a very good reputation among the shipyards, especially for his understanding of turbine engines, leading to his employment on both ships. He, like first-class stoker Henry Bridge, seems to have had a premonition that not everything was going to go smoothly on the voyage of the Cobra. He reportedly told friends before leaving Newcastle that he knew the danger. He thought that the Cobra would never reach her destination, but that he would do his duty. The Cobra was not yet in commission as she departed from the Tyne. It was intended that the Cobra would meet with the destroyer Albatross to conduct sea trials. It was a meeting that she would never reach. The weather had been good as the Cobra had departed from the Tyne at around 5 in the afternoon. But as the night progressed, the weather began to turn more nasty, until by 11 at night, when they found themselves in the middle of a nasty storm. By 7 in the morning of the 18th, the people on board of the Cobra were beginning to consider if there was a safe place where they could take shelter, but Lieutenant Bosworth Smith was no longer entirely certain where they were in the midst of the storm. Down in the engine room, the stokers were having trouble staying on their feet as the ship was rolling so badly. At some point, though it is not made clear when, some of the crew had donned lifebelts. The speed of the Cobra had also been slowed, a reasonable precaution since they were not certain of their position. While Lieutenant Bosworth Smith was keeping his place on the bridge of the ship as the Cobra battled against the storm, Chief Engineer Percy, who was normally stationed on the HMS Duke of Wellington, had remained at his post in the engine room since the ship had departed from the Tyne. Almost all of the engine crew were men provided by the shipyard, and Chief Engineer Percy's main task was to oversee them. Even the changing of the speed of the ship was not his responsibility on this occasion, but that was entirely communicated between the contractor crew and Lieutenant Bosworth Smith. Still, Chief Engineer Percy only left his post when at about 7 in the morning on the 18th, Lieutenant Bosworth Smith called him to the bridge and informed him that he had seen a lightship a couple miles away, and he wished to head for it. If they could find out what lightship it was, they could regain their bearings, and possibly find shelter. Chief Engineer Percy was still working on determining the course change, since he did not see the ship's compass on the bridge, when the ship gave 2 heavy rolls, and then there was a shock that ran through the ship. The Cobra was a long ship, with most of her weight in her middle due to her machinery. When she began to sink, it was amidships, and then almost immediately after she split in 2. Chief Engineer Percy had been lucky to be called up from the engine room when he was, and majority of those below never stood a chance of escape. Petty Officer Frederick Warner had been on the deck when the ship had begun to sink under their feet. The manager of the contractor crew had come to him and told him to get the boats ready, because the ship had broken her back, but there was no time to ready the collapsible boats. 5 of the ship's boats were reportedly made ready, but at least one of the dinghies collapsed almost immediately, and it was reported that the ship's whaleboat had been rushed by members of the contractor crew and had also gone to the bottom. Lieutenant Bosworth Smith does not seem to have made any effort to save himself, and he remained standing on the bridge as the 2 ends of his command both rose from the water to almost meet one another before the stern of the ship completely sank. Lieutenant Bosworth Smith was later seen in the water, but no one could say what happened to him in the chaos of the wreckage and other men. It is not known what happened to the other boats, but soon only one boat remained, under the command of First Class Petty Officer Barnes, who had been taking soundings on the deck after the ship had departed from the Tyne. He took his dinghy and did what he could to pull people from the water, in spite of the terrible storm that was still tossing them about. Among those he took from the water were Chief Engineer Percy and Petty Officer Warrener. In total, 12 men clung to the dinghy as their only chance of survival. The Cobra was not traveling unnoticed. The outer Dowsing Lightship had seen her, as had Captain Rogers of Steamship 8 of Yarmouth. Captain Rogers would say that he had seen the Cobra sailing in the storm near the Lightship, but that she had not seemed to be in distress. The only thing that he had noticed was that an unusual amount of steam was issuing from her third smokestack. This would coincide with the statement of a stoker who had survived, who also would say that the third boiler of the ship had become enveloped with steam right before the disaster struck. Captain Rogers would later admit that he definitely could have taken his ship to her aid, but she was not asking for it, and he did not see the need to approach her. He had continued on his way and had only learned of the disaster later. He would be absolved of all guilt by the courts, who admitted that even if the Cobra had been blowing distress signals, Captain Roger and his ship would have been too far away to hear them. The people on board the outer Dowsing Lightship had also not seen anything that drew any alarm from them initially. They had seen the Cobra enveloped in steam, but they did not think anything of it, and when the ship disappeared, they assumed that she had just continued on her voyage, until they saw her 4 smokestacks rise from the water to meet in the middle. It was not weather that made it possible to launch a small boat to offer aid. The people on the Lightship were forced to wait until they could signal a passing ship for aid. At around 5 in the afternoon, they were able to signal for the passing Yarmouth steam fishing vessel number 15 and send her to investigate. The Yarmouth vessel returned with the remains of 6 people on board and reported that the bow of the ship was sticking from the water like a shark fin. The lifebelts on the remains told them what ship had been lost. It was the Cobra. The Yarmouth fishing vessel traveled to Grimsby to announce the tragedy and reported that they had found no survivors. All had presumably been lost. Relying on the reports of the ship having been enveloped in steam right before she disappeared, it was initially reported that the Cobra had exploded, though this was soon corrected to state that she had broken in half upon closer inspection. Immediately, HMS Alarm, which had been stationed off of Grimsby, was dispatched to the scene to investigate. Fortunately, the news that there were no survivors proved to be incorrect. The 12 men in the dinghy, which was only designed to hold 8, had spent hours trying to attract passing vessels, but it was not until night was about to fall that they were noticed by the steamship Harlington and picked up. The Harlington brought the men to Portsmouth, where Chief Engineer Percy, who was now the only officer left of the Cobra, was able to telegraph the news to the Admiralty. In his telegraph, he stated that the Cobra had struck a rock and was broken in 2, and then named those who had survived. Out of the 12 survivors, only 2 of them were part of the crew provided by the shipyard. Both first-class Stoker Henry Bridge and James Crichton were among those who had been lost. Their prophecies about the fate of the Cobra had come true. Out of the 6 remains that were recovered, 3 of them were members of the Navy. These were buried with full naval honors under the supervision of the Admiralty. It was reported that 1,000 members of the Navy from various crews gathered to pay their last respects, as did the crew of the French naval vessel that happened to be in Grimsby at the time. The crews and captains of other ships based in Grimsby area also joined in the procession. The 3 members of the contractor crew, whose remains had been recovered, were all sent back to their homes for interment. A Cobra relief fund was soon started, to which Armstrong, Whitworth and Company alone donated £1,000. The Admiralty also reassured the Mayor of London that all widows and orphans would be provided with pensions. What happened to the Cobra was a matter of intense public interest. It was therefore no surprise that the inquest and court-martial that surrounded the loss of the ship was heavily publicized. The inquest occurred first, before the funerals, and already doubt was beginning to be placed on the idea that the Cobra had struck a rock. The crew did not report having felt a shock or a jolt as one would expect from striking a rock. Some of the members of the inquest voiced their opinions that the ship had been too weak, though the head of the inquest said that to make such a determination, they would need to call more experts. The determination of what exactly happened was made even more difficult because the Cobra could not be found. The bow of the ship, which had once been pointing out of the water, had at some point fallen below the water, and no one was sure of her exact position. It was not until halfway through the court-martial of Chief Engineer Percy that the remains of the Cobra were found. It turned out that the ship was indeed off of her course. She had traveled too far east in the storm, explaining why the lieutenant had not known where he was. The divers that were sent down declared that there was no sign of hitting anything, and that there was no rock nearby. It seemed as though the Cobra had simply collapsed. The court-martial called on the builders as well as the members of the Admiralty who had approved the purchase and refitting of the Cobra. Pearson's was the first to admit that the Cobra and the Viper had both been initially designed as fair-weather vessels, that they had not been designed to weather storms, and that their engines were much heavier than they were initially intended to carry. Those who had been in charge of the refitting of the Cobra stated that to make her any stronger would have involved reconstructing her from scratch, a complete rebuild, but that they had still done everything possible to strengthen her. It was declared that she was definitely not the same ship that had originally been sold to the Navy. Still, under more questioning, it was admitted that she was still not certainly as strong as other destroyers. It was determined that she had been hit by several big waves in the middle, and that had been enough to tip the balance and cause her to buckle under the weight of her machinery amidships. In the end, no fault was found with Chief Engineer Percy. Indeed, he was praised for doing what he could in the situation, as was First Class Petty Officer Barnes. The fault, the court-martial declared, was not with the crew and officers of the Cobra who had done their duty. The only regret of the loss of the Cobra, according to the court, was that the Navy had ever chosen to purchase her in the first place. For more information, please see the Evening Express from September 21st, 1901, or see our other sources in the description below. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for visiting the Shipwreck Archives. See you soon.